So, of course, once in the business and working at the various shops I worked at, my goal was always to work at as many shops as I could, to just see how many different ways of doing things there were. And, you know, I wasn't disappointed because every shop you work for has a different approach to the basics of the business. I spread myself around and got to work on a lot of cool things, and I think probably one of the biggest thrills for me had to be Jurassic Park. I mean, it was just a huge movie. Everything was gigantic in it, you know, from the 30-foot-long T-Rex to 50, 62-foot tall brachiosaur. And working on all of that stuff was really incredible. I remember when we moved the T-Rex down to Warner Brothers, to stage 16, where it lived for its life on the show. Loaded the thing on a flatbed semi at the shop in Van Nuys and took it down there stealthily under cover of darkness. We couldn't cover the thing because we didn't want the tarp flapping against it to beat it to death, so it was shipped exposed to the elements and just driven slowly down the street. So this giant semi heading down the street with a full-size dinosaur on the back of it, and loaded it in, and we all went down. We were used to seeing the way that the thing was in the shop, where the pumps and everything were sitting in the room with it, and you could always tell when the thing was fired up because, you know, you'd switch those pumps on and there was the requisite amount of noise that they made going with it. So once it was on stage, the pumps were all outside and the T-Rex moved noiselessly inside. When it was powered up, you had to be told that it was powered up, or you wouldn't have ever known. But that was where, again, it goes back to talking about the magic trick, and it always... That was where the T-Rex really became magical, because not only was it completed, which of course helps to have all the hints that it's fake taken away, so it looks like this real thing, but then it's moving noiselessly in this jungle environment. And, you know, on set, watching them, you know, put it through its paces was just remarkable, a remarkable thing. Second only to my own personal interface with the T-Rex. When I was, we were in the shop and finishing the assembly on it, I was riveting the legs, had to figure out a way to attach the legs to the understructure, knowing that there were these big hydraulic rams and it just had to be such a positive bond onto the thing that the legs wouldn't get ripped off. So we felt glue wasn't enough. So we made these saddlebags, basically, that were riveted to the carbon fiber underskull and then attached to the inside of the big polyfoam leg sections on the thing. So I'm sitting on the hip bone section of the T-Rex, riveting these things on the legs and doing all of that. And I get a call up from Lloyd Ball, who's down there, and he goes, "We got to fire up the T-Rex. We got to test a move on it." So do you want me to get down? Nah, it's okay. You're fine where you are. So I got to actually ride the T-Rex. While it was powered up and turned on and moving around, I'm up on top of the T-Rex riding it, which was that was probably one of the coolest things that I got to do in the shop ever. I think other than on-set stuff, the other obvious standout career highlight would be last season on The Walking Dead, when we flew back here in the middle of the season in September for the Emmy Awards and ended up getting an Emmy for Outstanding Prosthetic Makeup on the first episode, the pilot episode of The Walking Dead. You can't beat that. Well, you know, I always go back to Planet of the Apes because that, to me, I read the novel before I saw the movie. And it was a film novelization, although it was funny because only the cover. You know, the cover, I remember having these great shots of the profiles of Cornelius's makeup and stuff, and but I was already well on my way to loving makeup prior to that. So I say I always reference Planet of the Apes, but it goes back further than that. You know, my mom and dad were both really active in community theater in Wyoming, and my earliest memory of being enraptured with the makeup world was going backstage when I was about 6 after a production that my mom was in of Little Mary Sunshine. She played the lead. And so after the show, she's like, "Come on back and meet the other actors." So I went back, and it was just this crazy Cabinet of Dr. Caligari world where you're backstage and there's all this smell of the theatrical makeup and all these people. And you know, when they're on stage, they look relatively normal, and you go back and you see the theatricality of everything that they've painted on. And I just remember being just mesmerized by looking at all these crazy, you know, small town actors back there in their crazy makeup and costumes and stuff. It was a magical world. And that's kind of the genesis of everything, is, you know, for me, is the magic of it, you know. So being a young kid, a kid who's in a small town, and my brother exhibited some artistic talent, my older brother, and so it was, I think creativity was always sort of encouraged in my family. And I remember sitting in the basement. We had a laundry room in the basement that was all like an unfinished concrete floor room, and it was big enough to have my dad's workbench in there, which we weren't allowed to touch, and then a small kitchen table with a bunch of stuff on it for us that we were allowed to touch. And so it was doing things like sitting at that table and building model kits, and then branching out from there to customizing those model kits, and then going from that to getting clay from the local art supply. I remember sculpting a dinosaur puppet, like a lizardy kind of weird puppet that I made the head out of paper mache and painted it in a fabric body and that sort of thing. And that was the early sort of genesis of that stuff. But my brothers, when we got to be, I was 12, so they were 14 and 15. And I was their sometimes unwilling guinea pig for stuff that they were learning to do. So they got plaster, and they said, you know, we can do a cast of your face with this plaster. I went, great. Not knowing what I was in for, Vaselined up my face, and they poured plaster all over it. And then, you know, we didn't know the whole concept of doing a flexible mold to make a rigid material, you know, et cetera. So we're pouring up plaster inside the plaster mold of my face. Unfortunately, a little kid and this much of his face, you don't have many undercuts, so it would come off okay. But sometimes we had to break the plaster off of the other plaster mold. But then we started doing things like using those plaster shells of our, you know, plaster casts of our faces, and painting liquid latex in. And so those were the first rubber masks I made, were my own 12-year-old face, you know. So you're sitting there as a kid, and you put the mask on and go, hey, who do I look like? Well, you look like you because it's your face. So there was that kind of stuff. And my mom used to make Halloween costumes for me when I was a kid, and she would then do my makeup on top of that because of her theatrical background. So that was kind of learning some of those things. I remember as a little kid, my mom made me an Uncle Sam costume. I'm 9. My mom makes me up as Uncle Sam, and borrowing stuff from the local theater department, you know, that they worked with a lot. She used spirit gum and glued crepe hair on it, sort of the goatee. My 9-year-old face was burning like crazy, the stuff. And then she asked one of her friends what she could use to make my hair white, my 1/8-inch long shorn hair. And they suggested white shoe polish. So there's my mom with white shoe polish in my hair. And then, of course, the ordeal of trying to get that out of my hair, trial and error, lots of crazy stuff like that. I think as I got older and became a fan of things like the original Frankenstein movies and Phantom of the Opera and, you know, all of those kind of seminal early makeup films, was when I first started becoming aware of the names behind makeup. I didn't know any contemporary makeup artists at that time because, you know, my friends and I stayed up late, sleepovers, we'd stayed up late and watched creature features, which always seemed to feature Jack Pierce era films. And so I think Jack Pierce was probably the first person whose name I knew, along with Lon Chaney Sr., for doing makeups, and was mesmerized by those things. And they seemed somehow kind of accessible because they seemed a little homemade, you know, as great as they are. The Phantom of the Opera makeup with the nose putty cheekbones and that kind of things. At least it was makeup materials that I had heard of, you know, and you started getting into foam latex, and those makeups were less accessible to me as a kid because how do you divine how to make a foam latex mold, or where do you get the materials and those sorts of things? And that, as I got older and borrowed from my high school theater instructor, I borrowed the Richard Corson stage makeup book. And that opened up a whole new list of people to think about, you know, because they had the great pictorials in there of Dick Smith doing the Hal Holbrook makeup on, or the Mark Twain makeup on Hal Holbrook, and doing the Little Big Man makeup on Dustin Hoffman, the 120-year-old man. So those, all of a sudden, I was a huge fan of Dick Smith's makeup work because just look at his stuff. But those it took me a long time coming from the limited access I had to materials, and sort of there's an attitude that you have to cultivate as a person in an outlying area of just, I'm not going to give up. I'm going to figure out how to get what I need to get to do the stuff, to make the effect I want to make. So growing up in Montana, I think it just was such a challenge to do everything, because the local theatrical supply had the bare bones of materials. They had traditional spirit gum. If you were lucky, you might be able to get liquid latex, but more than likely you had to go to the local hobby shop for that. Pottery plaster, it's things that are sort of staples of the industry, just weren't available. And I was the kid going into the makeup supply store, the theatrical makeup supply, and saying, "Do you have foam rubber?" "No." "Could you order some for me?" I wouldn't know where to get that. "You can get it from Alcone Company in New York." "Who?" "Alcone Company in New York." So finally I just stopped going to the makeup supply company there, and I said, you know, I'll just, and these places are all lofty, you know, it's like you imagine Alcone Company as being some mega corporation in New York, and it's like, "I'm sorry, kid, we only deal with professional makeup artists." Click. Not at all the case, of course. They're a business and they want to sell product, and so when you call them up and you say, "Could you send me some foam latex, sir?" They go, "Absolutely, what's your address?" And so that's a revelation. So I went from depending on the local makeup supply to buying all of my supplies from a theatrical supply company in New York. And then books started becoming available on the subject. And after I'd already had what I thought was a pretty good grounding in how to make a foam latex appliance mold and those kinds of things that I just sort of figured out on my own, then these books started showing up on the subject, like the Al Taylor book, Making a Monster, and the book, the John Caglione and Lee Bagan book on three-dimensional makeup, which were great books and sort of validating in that, like, I'd figured out how to make a foam latex appliance mold by myself, figured out how to, from looking at the pictures of Dick Smith's molds in the Richard Corson book, I went, what's that he did around the edge of the mold? Oh, that's flashing, you know, I put that on. So getting the Lee Bagan book validated a lot of what I was doing. I went, wow, look at that. I sort of dummied out a way to make a foam latex mold, and it turned out it was the right way to do it, or the industry standard way to do it. So that was very satisfying. And then the other thing I got from the Al Taylor book was there were addresses in there for a couple of people. There was an address in there for Charlie Schramm. There was an address in there for John Chambers. And I thought, well, I'm going to write to these guys, and what can they say? What's the worst they can say? Well, the worst is you just never hear from them. You know, some jerk kid in Montana. But I got a letter back from Charlie Schramm, and Charlie was selling at the time the George Bow foam latex formula. And that, after working with the stuff that you could get from Alcone, that was a revelation. So I got that when I was about 19, was the first, or 20-ish. It was the first time I worked with that, and it was just unbelievably beautiful stuff compared to what I'd been working with prior to that. And it just sort of, but it was an evolution. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say about the whole thing and telling the stories is that I learned a little at a time, and it was an evolution in learning how to use the materials. Lots of mistakes, lots and lots of mistakes, more mistakes than successes. And then when I hit about 25, my mid-20s, that was the time when Dick Smith won the Oscar for Amadeus. And as a backstory, I grew up in Billings, Montana, where they filmed Little Big Man. And they filmed a lot of it on the ranch that belonged to the dean of girls at our high school and her husband. So I was working for the newspaper. My friend Christine was the entertainment editor for the newspaper. And this woman came in that she had been friends with for years, and she said, Oh, I was just wondering, asking Christine, who won the makeup Oscar for makeup this year? And she said, Dick Smith. She goes, oh, I have to write him a letter and tell him congratulations. Starts to walk off. And Christine goes, wait a minute. You have Dick Smith's address? Oh, yeah, he and I became friends when they were here shooting Little Big Man. I have this friend who would love to get in touch with him. And she says, well, let me check with Dick and see if it's okay if I give out his address. And if it is, then fine. So she checked. It was. The friend was me. So I write to Dick. Congratulations, Mr. Smith, on your success for Amadeus. I thought it was beautiful makeup. And by the way, here are a couple of pictures of some stuff that I've done. And one of them was a Neanderthal makeup that I'd done on myself that was kind of fun. Teeth and a wig that I had made. I learned how to tie hair and handmade a wig. So Dick writes back. He goes, I liked your makeup. Who made the wig for your Neanderthal character? I wrote him back and I said, I made the wig. I said, you know, I live in Montana. What can I say? If you want a wig, a hand-tied wig, you pretty much have to do it yourself. I said, so I taught myself how to do all of these things. So Dick wrote me back. And he said, listen, I'm putting together this advanced professional makeup course. And he said, I think that you exhibit the skills necessary to be taking this if you're interested in taking it. It's $1,500 and blah, blah, blah. I went, would I? So I signed up for that, and that's what really kicked everything into high gear and got me. I mean, I had decided prior to all of that happening that I was going to move to Los Angeles and going to get into doing makeup as a career. But that really gave me a lot of impetus to do that, you know. So, I mean, the very first lesson of the course, the back page of the very first lesson was a listing of every makeup effects shop in Hollywood and their phone number and address. And I thought, well, there you go. It was all the tools I need. I had already, you know, after years of sort of sleuthing out materials and all that stuff, I wasn't afraid to call whomever. So I thought, well, there you go. I've got a list of every phone number I could possibly ask for. So it wasn't too long after that. I waited until about halfway through the course to move to Los Angeles. I thought if I wait till the end, every Yahoo who's taken this course is going to be out there trying to get a job. So I thought I'd beat them to the punch. I didn't realize it was only 100 of us, and that most of the people who were taking the course were already professionals in the business. But so that was the impetus that gave me to get out and get going. So I used the few connections I had. I'd been talking to this guy who had a company called The Makeup Place, Dennis Curcio. And I talked to him on the phone a lot when I ordered things. He had moved out to L.A., and when I moved out, I just gave Dennis a call. We went and had breakfast. And I said, who do you think would be a good shop to get started with? He gave me a name of a guy, Moni Monsano, and Moni had a place called Canon Makeup Lab, which fortuitously was not very far from my house. And I called Moni. I got an interview there, and I met a bunch of great people working there. Rob Berman and Bill Sturgeon and a bunch of other, John Price, a bunch of guys, all worked there at the time. And that was, I've worked pretty much every day since, every day that I've wanted to. I didn't have a lot to do with this other than the fact that I worked on the film and I was puppeteering when all of this happened, but it was on Terminator 2. There's a scene in the movie where the T-1000 has a girder and the T-100, Arnold, is against a wall and he's being bashed repeatedly in the head with this big steel girder. They had built a wooden girder to stand in for the steel girder, and we had a flexible puppet head that was made to get its brains bashed out. And Stan was shooting second unit on the thing, so he was directing as we're there, and he's, you know, encouraging us to beat the living daylights out of this head. And so we got what we thought was a pretty good take, and Stan calls Jim Cameron over. And Cameron looks at the footage and he goes, you can totally tell that that's a flexible rubber head and that it's caving in every time you hit it with the, what can we do about that? Well, we didn't have anything else prepped. That was the gag. It was, you know, we figured that the hitting was going to be happening so fast that you just wouldn't see that happening, but Jim's eye saw it. So in the heat of the moment, the only solution we had was to take one of our hero puppet heads, one of our radio-controlled Arnold Schwarzenegger, fully articulated puppet heads. And we put it in there, and Jim Cameron was there with us, and Jim said, "I'll man the girder." So Jim got on the wooden girder. We put this very expensive, completely electronic, radio-controlled puppet head in there, and Jim proceeded to just pummel the living daylights out of it. And we looked at the footage, and he went, "Perfect." And he went back to first unit to start filming again. So we take this broken mass down to the trailer, and Craig Caton, who had built a lot of that head, Craig was down there looking at it, and Stan walks in. And he says, "How bad is it?" And Craig, "Well, it's destroyed, Stan." He says, "I mean, the underskull's broken into 3 pretty big sections, but it's completely fractured and just flat." And Stan says, "You think we could have that put together by 9 a.m. tomorrow so we can shoot with it some more?" And we did. And bottom line, Craig looked at it and figured out that it was what he needed to do to repair it, and we got it all back together and working again for the next day. So I came into the business with certain preconceived notions of what skills you would have to be successful, and most of my my theorizing about that, my feeling about what skills I would have to have were based on artistic skills. And I think that to an extent that's, it served me well because I was able to move up the ladder fairly quickly once I got in the business. I had a pretty broad background, a broad skill set, and at the time in the business that was really what was required because you weren't hired onto a show as a mold maker. You were hired onto the show as a makeup effects guy. And that meant that sometimes you'd be helping with life casts in the beginning and you'd be transitioning into making molds and maybe sculpting, if you were lucky, sculpting, and then running foam or polyfoam and seaming and painting and doing hair work, hair punching. Certainly a lot of people were called on to do, not necessarily tying. So all of the, I mean, I think that having a broad foundation of basic makeup skills is really important. But then you learn the business side of it too, you know. It's knowing how to behave on set, to not go there with a fanboy attitude and badger the actors, and you know, to just be cool, just lay back on set and not be in people's faces. To, as people say, to play well with others. You know, I think that that's really important. And the people, you find the people who have a long career in the business tend to be masters of that. They know how to assert themselves and when to assert themselves in work situations and get along. I mean, getting along is very important. When I first got into the business, I used to tell my wife that I said, you know, there's so many people in this business, and there were at the time, well, I won't say so many, I'll say that there were definitely characters within the industry who were sort of noted for their tardiness. They would show up 4 hours late, or they would not show up at all on a certain day when they were called upon to be there. And people just kind of worked around that. I said, you know, it's alarming. But I said, I kind of get the impression that the only thing you have to do to make it to the top in this business is show up every day in a timely fashion. But that speaks to exactly what I'm talking about, which is professionalism. It's being punctual. People who are at the top of the field don't show up at their call time and start setting up from there. They show up, some of them, an hour ahead of time so that they know that they're set and they know that they have what they need organized for the day. And they've gotten, if you're working on a makeup, like, for instance, on The Walking Dead, when we come in, we know that we've got 45 hero makeups to do, but you have to go and pull whatever selection of appliances you want for those makeups. So you come in early knowing that you've got a certain amount of prep to do to get everything ready to film. It's sort of being a problem solver. And I think that I've started saying that we're not so much makeup artists anymore, or maybe we never were, as we are problem solvers. It starts when you get a script, and you break down the script, and it says we need to have a guy whose head explodes. Well, how are you going to do that? And you start having conversations with the director and the production designer, maybe, and the wardrobe department and the actor, and you have to interface with all of these different departments and people successfully, and realistically, because you don't oversell what you're going to do. Oh yeah, it's going to be this and it's blah blah blah. Sometimes it really works best to go in and just say, listen, I'm working within these parameters. I have no head cast for the actor. I have no time to prep it. I'm doing all of these things. What help can you give me? That's a very important question to know how to be able to ask and when to ask it. What help can you give me? Sometimes your DP can say, listen, this is all going to be shot in the dark anyway. We'll backlight the heck out of it, and we'll see blood spray, and we won't really see, we'll give the illusion of the effect. Thank you so much, And then you go with the director and say, listen, we're talking about shooting this like this. Is this okay with you? Fine, perfect, whatever you need to get the effect. Fantastic. And sometimes those are very effective shots, because what the audience thinks it's seeing and what it's really seeing are two different things. My mother swears that in Psycho, in the original Psycho, that she saw a knife plunging into Janet Leigh. I said, you never saw that? No, I'm positive that that's what I saw. I said, I'll guarantee you never saw that. And you look through that entire sequence, the only time you ever see a knife and the actress in frame at the same time, there's a shot where the knife kind of grazes across her stomach, but it doesn't penetrate anything. So it's all in how it's shot and staged and put together. And that's, again, harkens back to the magic trick of everything. And it's what I like about painting. It's what I like about doing makeup effects, is it's magic. You're staging something that you want the audience to believe is real, whether it's a giant dinosaur, whether it's a guy who's got scissors for hands, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or Mark Twain or any myriad of historical characters who are no longer alive that you're bringing back to life in a movie. It's all about the magic trick.